Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to review the second episode of Season 5 of Star Trek Discovery. But first I want to mention a few things I missed from the previous episode. And there was a very good point by a commentator of mine who said it's funny how they can easily access the android's memory, but Data said in First Contact that the codes stored in his neural net cannot be forcibly removed. So how can they get data out of the Sung droid so easily? And I was going to respond to that by saying that with 31st century technology, they might be able to do what 24th century Borg could not. But I then rewatched that scene and I noticed that Stamets says that he is doing that with 23rd century technology that he had in storage because they said, oh, they don't have any wires to connect to the Android. And then Stamets said, oh, I'll just go and get some because I keep some old stuff backed up. And so he's actually using old technology, another current day 31st century technology. And so it is indeed a contradiction, it is indeed stupid, since how come the Borg could not hook up into Data's brain so easily as they do with this other Sung android, which is supposed to be more advanced than Data since it came later. So it's possible Alton Sung, the later Sung, actually made his brain more accessible than the previous models. And also they did say in the scene they extracted the data from his eye and not his actual brain, so that might explain it. But again, how come the Borg couldn't do it with Data? Because Data locked the computer with some very long code, and so how come they couldn't hack into his eye to get that out? Maybe he deleted it after he did it and only kept it in his brain in a more hidden area. So I guess I can come up with excuses, but the writers obviously just didn't think about any of this. But granted, I also didn't really notice this nitpick. So this is something that is forgivable, especially since we can come up with excuses and explanations. It being the 31st century, maybe the computer can more easily decrypt the memories of the android, and so I don't really consider it a mistake, but it is an interesting nitpick simply because it's fun to discuss. So thanks for that comment. I also want to correct a mistake I said in the previous review when I was talking about how illogical it is that Starfleet cancelled the Spore drive program, that they gave up on it. And Stamets says it's because it didn't yet solve the navigator problem. And I said, but you did solve it. You had that prototype of a next generation Spore drive, which Book installed on his ship. And I forgot that it was actually Book who was the navigator because he magically had that same ability. And maybe that's one of the reasons the writers decided to kill off his whole planet, because otherwise we'll simply say, why don't you just recruit his people to be the pilots of this new Spore drive and so on. So maybe that's why they killed all of them except him. And so it slipped my mind that he was the navigator. So maybe they haven't yet found a way to bypass this problem, and I'm guessing genetic engineering is still outlawed in this future, and so they cannot simply copy the tardigrade DNA from Stamets to other people to make them the navigators. And so even though they can duplicate the technology itself, they cannot find any new navigators except for Book and Stamets. So it makes a little bit more sense now, but if you look back at the previous season, we had a scene of the president of the Federation being extremely angry that the prototype was stolen, and she was saying how the Spore drive is the best hope for the Federation because that's the only way they can end their dilithium dependency. So even though they found that huge planet made of dilithium in the end of season 3, which probably gave them maybe a few hundred years more of fuel, but eventually it will run out as well, and so they'll have the same problem again. And so the president was saying how important the Spore drive is, and she said because the Spore drive prototype was stolen, it threatens everything, all the hope for the galaxy and all of that. So if it was so important just one season ago, and it was after they discovered the Dilithium planet, so if it was so important, so why are they now cancelling it? Just because they didn't quickly manage to find a solution to the navigator problem. So either you find a synthetic way to make a navigator without genetic engineering, or simply make an exception in the law to allow for that small piece of tardigrade DNA to be copied to other people, and then you'll have all the navigators you need. So I guess it wasn't so important after all, and Starfleet just cancelled the program. So it still doesn't really make much sense, but I take back what I said about the contradiction of the navigator problem being solved, because it was Book who was the navigator, so that was my mistake. Another thing I want to correct myself from the previous review is that Michael apparently immediately recognized that planet simply from a drawing because it has 2 moons, but actually I rewatched that scene and I see that the computer itself said the name of that planet. And then she goes to Kovic and threatens him that if he doesn't clue her in on what's actually going on, then she will not let him know which planet it was. So is she going to erase that from the ship's computer? Is she going to prevent Kovic from learning about it from the rest of the crew or the ship's computer? So how exactly is she going to keep it hidden if it's not just in her own memory, but it's now in the database of the Discovery computer, which he obviously controls all of Starfleet apparently. And apparently he's already been searching for a planet with two moons, because that's what he's doing in that holodeck when she came over. And then she tells him it will take you hundreds of years to go over all the possible planets which have two moons, and then she reveals that specific system which the computer recognized. And I guess the name of that planet was written in the text itself since it appeared on the screen, or maybe Zora, the ship's computer, was the one who found it because it was written in the text that it's not just two moons, but they're in perfect sync with each other. And that's something I mentioned being stupid in the previous review, but I want to elaborate on that because that is literally physically impossible, because the way they show it, and we see these moons in this episode, so they're always together, so they're both in orbit of the same planet, and yet they're always close by to each other, and they're not spinning around each other. Apparently one of them is simply higher than the other. One is closer to the planet and one is farther away, and so that is simply impossible in any situation, because the closer a moon is to a planet, the faster it has to be moving to avoid falling on the planet. So if the other moon has to be next to the first one at all times, that means it must be moving even faster because it has a bigger distance from the planet. But if that's the case, then it should fly off out of orbit, and so it's simply impossible no matter what. Now you might try to make up excuses. Maybe one moon is actually lighter than the other, maybe one is much more massive even though they appear to be the same size, but maybe one is much more dense than the other and one is lighter than the other. Maybe we can say one of the moons is pulling on the other, but again it wouldn't really work, and it simply wouldn't be a stable system. Maybe it could work for a short while somehow, but it cannot possibly be maintained for long. And remember, this planet was found in the diary from 800 years ago, and also it's a planet that belonged to the Promilians, who were themselves an ancient humanoid species. Remember that Promilian starship that Picard always fantasized about finding because he's a fan of archaeology? So that was a species 1,000 years before the Federation even existed. They were already in the stars. So this planet belonged to a very ancient people, and all of this was in a diary from 800 years ago. And when they arrived to the planet in this episode, we see the moons are indeed close by to each other. So that means it is a stable system, and yet it makes no logical sense because the two moons cannot be close by in an orbit together. I cannot imagine how it can work. Maybe I'm wrong. If someone wants to correct me, please let me know in the comments. I would love to discuss this. So anyway, moving on to episode 2, which begins with Michael whispering into her log about all the philosophical ramifications of discovering the origins of life and all of that. And I'm thinking, wait, didn't she already know about it? I mean, the whole progenitor story was not classified to my knowledge, so everyone in the Federation should already know about it. And she had a long time by now to catch up on all the history and all of that, so how come she's reacting as if it's the first time she hears about the progenitors and all of that after Kovic told it to her? Apparently she never knew about it from before. And even back in TNG, I remember thinking it doesn't really make much sense that all of them are so surprised by this, because such a theory should have been popular in the Federation and in the galaxy anyway, because of the simple fact that so many of the aliens are so much alike that it has to be the explanation. So even before they found it out in the TNG episode The Chase, it should have been a widespread theory anyway, that there must have been some originator of all the humanoids, because otherwise you simply cannot logically explain it. How come most aliens look like humans? So anyway, how come Michael is so shocked and surprised by all of this and shaken to her core and is whispering into a very long log and all of that? I guess it's necessary for the audience, but it doesn't really make much sense in universe. Then we see that trial, which I briefly mentioned in my previous review, that Starfleet and the Federation president is personally judging that other captain for causing that avalanche that almost killed some people on some desert planet. And even though it wasn't him directly who caused it, it was those bad guys, but they were inspired by something he did previously, and that's why he's somehow to blame for it. And also, he was following the red directive. He was trying to do whatever was necessary to stop them from escaping with that item, which is exactly what Kovic instructed. And he directly said it's even allowed to use deadly lethal force to accomplish the mission. And yet the captain is now being judged for being too aggressive, I guess. It's not really properly explained. And he's been kicked out of Starfleet. And also in that meeting, we see that same alien that I mentioned was in the party previously. So is that exactly the same guy or simply the same type of alien? And I mentioned how in previous seasons, every time they come up with some new alien mask, suddenly those types of aliens are everywhere because they're now showing it off. And also, it's always kind of a too big of a head for the body. Like the body is always a human-sized body, I guess because they don't want to design a bigger, more fitting uniform. And so it's always some skinny guy wearing a huge alien head, and it's a different alien head every season. And this one looks kind of ridiculous because his eyes, even though they are blinking, so they took care to make him blink, but the eyes are always looking somewhere at the ceiling, so he's not looking at anything, and so it just looks really fake and ridiculous, especially because it's a big head on a small body. Then Michael comes to visit Book in his quarters, and he still has his cat Grudge, and Michael is using some kind of remote control to project a holographic mouse which is running all over the place, and the mouse is glowing because otherwise I guess the audience wouldn't know it's a hologram. That's why it has to glow like that, and the cat doesn't even react to it in any way. Didn't they previously mention something about the cat hating holograms or something? So I don't think the writers themselves remember. And also in this episode there was at least an excuse for why they cannot simply beam anywhere they want. They said there's some kind of interference around that graveyard area, and so they can only beam outside of it, and then we'll have to walk all the way into it. And I kind of wonder, why didn't they simply take a few of those hovering bikes from the previous episode? If they took a few of them down to this planet, then they wouldn't have to walk all the way. They can quickly get to where they want to go without beaming. Beam to the outer edge of that interference, but beam there with some bikes or some other vehicles to simply be able to get to your destination quicker. Why do you have to walk all the way there? I mean, it's not as if all technology doesn't work, because they do use all their holograms and their phasers, and all of that is working. And so how come they couldn't bring some kind of vehicle with them instead of walking a long distance in the forest? And so it again doesn't really make any sense. And meanwhile on the ship, Book comes to sickbay to help the doctor, and Dr. Colbert immediately hugs him and being kind of over friendly with him, and they were never really so close. I guess he was his therapist in the previous season or something, but again they were never such close friends. So anyway, Book helps him to figure out about those two guys, the Scroll guy and Shin Hoti, and he immediately figures out that they're a couple who are in love, and that they're thrill seekers, and I guess it reminds him of himself and Michael in those days when they were working together on his ship, and somehow he is able to tell all of that just by looking at how they flew their ship and stuff like that. So anyway, back on the planet we see that some of those statues kind of wake up and their eyes fly out of their sockets, and they're kind of drones that are trying to kill Michael and Saru, and they're running away from it in the forest. It kind of reminded me of that episode from early TNG called The Arsenal of Freedom, when Picard and Dr. Crusher were running away from those drones, shooting at them in the forest. And even though special effects came a long way, I think in those old episodes those drone hunters were kind of cooler because they had an interesting design, they were behaving in a clever way and stuff like that. And here is just kind of generic flying balls that shoot lasers, and that's it. There's nothing really original at all about any of this. And at some point Saru simply uses his head darts to shoot at all those balls, and it makes all of them explode. And that was a really ridiculous moment because, you know, I can buy the fact that he has some kind of biological defense mechanism and he can shoot some kind of darts out of his head, fine. But how can those darts penetrate metallic machines and make them blow up? That seems kind of overpowered, and so that part kind of made me laugh. And there's a scene of Michael crying because she was so worried about Saru, and she's so over-emotional as always, so that's always funny how much she cries in this show. And we also had the scene of Saru praising Michael, saying how much he inspired him, she's the bestest ever, and all that kind of dialogue. And it was as if they were saying goodbye, and so it did create a kind of sense of danger for Saru, the fact that Michael is so worried about putting him in danger because he's about to get married, and he's saying all these warm words to her as if it's his final time with her. And so that did kind of work, that it made me think they're actually going to kill him off, but then he survived because he has magical darts that can blow up advanced metallic battle drones out from the sky somehow, so that was kind of funny. And finally they find that artifact they were looking for, and it says some kind of cryptic message which they think means they have to go to Beta Z, but then she thinks, wait, maybe it's actually false. and the real message is from behind, and so they look around and then they find the real message, which says something about the joining of two minds. And I'm immediately thinking about Vulcans, my mind to your mind, my thoughts to your thoughts, our minds are merging, becoming one, so obviously it means a Vulcan mind meld, right? So I'm thinking they're going to go to Vulcan next, and maybe the Vulcan president will be involved and all of that, but actually no, they're going to Trill. So the joining of two minds somehow makes them think it's referencing the Trill. But the Trill are actually more than two minds. I guess it's the symbiote and the host, but the symbiote also contains all the previous minds, and so the text doesn't really imply Trill, it implies Vulcans, and yet they all seem to think, no, it's the Trill, so we're going to the Trill planet next. And I'm like, why? And how would the Promillions even know about the Trill? Didn't the Trill used to be a very secretive society that no one knew anything about them, and so how could the Promillions know about the Trill from 2000 years previously? And so none of this makes any sense. And why did none of them even suggest the possibility maybe it's referring to Vulcan, since, joining of two minds, that's the Vulcan mind meld? And previously they were thinking about Beta Z because it was implying something about telepathy, and so suddenly it's the Trill. Why? Because maybe Adira needs some new storyline. And by the way, Adira, when she first showed up on this show, that was probably the only episode I actually liked, and I really liked Adira at first in that episode on her home planet, but ever since then she was a terrible character. Like, they did nothing with her, or them, sorry, because it's not a woman apparently, it's something, not a man, not a woman, that's what they're claiming the actor is. So anyway, maybe next episode we'll get to see the Trill planet again. Maybe they'll finally do something interesting with Adira. Maybe they can explain how come Adira doesn't apparently have any of the previous personalities. Why is she behaving like a nerdy kid and not someone with the experience of multiple lifetimes? And so something is way off about Adira, so maybe they'll finally explain it in the next episode and maybe fix it. Then there's a scene of Book looking at the hologram of Shin Hoti, and he tells the computer to age her down to age 7, and the computer does that, but the little girl we see looks absolutely nothing alike like the adult version. So what the hell, couldn't they pick someone who looks a little bit similar? And how could the computer know that the hair needs to be a different color, and the eyes seem to be a different color, and the nose is different, and the lips are different? It looks nothing like her at all, so that also made me laugh at how ridiculous it was. Like, no one in the production took the smallest effort to find someone similar, and so maybe it's part of that whole attitude of, looks don't matter, you shouldn't judge someone by their looks. And I had a similar problem with that scene when the Admiral is in his quarters and we see a picture of his family, and his daughter doesn't seem to be the same ethnicity as him and his wife, and that also kind of raised an eyebrow for me, because I guess she might be adopted, but why not find someone who looks like their parents? So maybe it's deliberate as part of the anti-racism message of making us used to having adopted children of all ethnicities and all of that. If that's the case, then shouldn't they mention that in the dialogue somewhere that we'll know that's the case? Otherwise it's kind of distracting because it just raises eyebrows. But a much bigger problem is with the Shin Hoti lady, who looks nothing like the kid she supposedly used to be, like absolutely nothing alike. And so that's the same person, so you cannot say it's an adoptive daughter or some other excuse. And so it's just lazy production. They couldn't find a kid who looks similar, or at least give her similar hair or something to make it slightly similar. It was so distracting to me how unsimilar they are, so it's just kind of funny. And then Book says that he knows her from that time because she was the daughter of his mentor, whose name was Cleveland Booker. That's who he goes after for some reason. That's something he mentioned in previous seasons, that he knew someone by that name and he took that name for himself because that was his adoptive father or whatever, and so that was his daughter, and therefore that's the closest person he has to family. And all this part kind of made me facepalm, because once again they're kind of forcibly inserting all this fake drama into the show, so she's like his spiritual daughter or something, so there's going to be that dynamic of him trying to turn her back from the dark side or whatever, and it's kind of ridiculous. Also, it makes the galaxy seem smaller again, so he just happens to know her, like it's a huge galaxy, they stumbled on these two criminals, and she just happens to be someone he knew as a kid, and she's the daughter of his friend who is his mentor and he took his name from. How come she didn't recognize him? Like when they were talking on the subspace radio and she heard his name, he knew of him, and so how come she didn't know that she's somehow related to him? She had zero reaction to it. And all of this makes the galaxy seem so small that everyone knows each other. He just happens to know her. So all of this is absolutely ridiculous. And then Michael comes to talk with that captain who got demoted and got kicked out of Starfleet, and she offers to make him her number one. And I'm thinking, why? Why would you want that? In the last two episodes, you kept bickering with him, he kept contradicting you, he kept disobeying everything you want to do, he kept doing reckless things, and he kept objecting to every single idea you had, he kept doing the opposite of what you wanted to do, so why would you want him to be your first officer? And he even tells her in the end that he's not going to change, he's going to do whatever he wants to do, and she says, okay, that's fine, so why? Why would you want such a first officer that will cause you trouble? So that was laughable as well. And that pretty much sums up the whole episode, which was kind of boring. You know, the first episode, as bad as it was, it at least had some interesting bits, and it did have all kinds of action scenes which were ridiculous, but at least it wasn't a boring episode. And yet the second episode was extremely boring in my opinion, and the only action scenes were running around on some planet being chased by flying balls that shoot at you, and then Saru destroys them with his head darts easily. How come he couldn't do it earlier? Because at first they were running away, they were shooting at the phasers at them, and only later on he used his head darts to do it. And they seem to be explosive darts that can take out machinery, so that was just absolutely stupid. So the episode was pretty bad, it was much more boring than the previous episode, nothing was revealed, no new information except really silly stuff like she and Hoti being related to Book, which is ridiculous, and the Promelians having four eyes in their statues. Again, not a direct contradiction because maybe that's their gods in the statues and not themselves, but still it's kind of seems like a contradiction. And the overall plot, I'm guessing, is going to run through the whole 10 episodes, and so we're going to have very slow pacing. And going to the Trill planet again might be good if they do something like in the previous time we were there. That was the only episode I kind of liked in the whole show. And maybe they can finally fix Adira's character, because that was a character with so much potential. I remember in season 3 when Adira came on board and it was revealed it's a Trill, I was very excited. I thought, oh, we're going to get an awesome character and character development. Like, she starts out without any memories of the other host, and then she gains them, but then she becomes more nerdy and shy and insecure after that, which is the complete opposite of what should be happening. So something is way off about Adira, so maybe they can finally fix it and do something with that character. So hopefully, but most likely they will not. Most likely it will be a terrible season. Based on what I've seen in this episode, I don't have high hopes. That's my opinion. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss it in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.